It is said that the deepest silences are not those of empty spaces, but of rooms that have known life and lost it. The silence that fell upon the Harwick homestead in the autumn of 1851 was of this latter, heavier kind. It was a tangible thing, a weight that settled in the corners of their small cabin, clung to the woolen blankets, and filled the space between a husband and a wife who no longer had the words to bridge it. But the silence, however profound, was not the most terrifying sound in that lonely Ozark valley. The true horror began when the silence was broken. It was broken by the voice of their 7-year-old son, Benjamin, who had not spoken a proper word since his twin sister, Elspeth, had been taken by the fever a month prior. His first utterance was not of grief, nor a cry for his mother, nor a question for his father. It was a sound that did not belong in the mouth of a child, or indeed in the mouth of any man. It was a string of guttural clicks, sibilant hisses, and long, drawn-out vowels that resonated with the hollow, mournful quality of a broken reed instrument. It was a language of that his parents were certain, for it possessed a chillingly deliberate cadence, a syntax of dread, and a grammar of pure, unadulterated wrongness. It poured from him not in a torrent, but in a slow, measured stream, as if he were patiently explaining some fundamental, cosmic truth to a listener that only he could perceive in the thick, suffocating air of the cabin. His father, Silas Harwick, a man whose soul was hewn from the unforgiving granite of Calvinist doctrine, felt the sound as a physical blow, a violation of the natural order that God had ordained. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a vibration that threatened to shake loose the foundations of his faith. For Ada, his wife, the sound was somehow worse. It was the antithesis of the secret, silent language her twins had once shared, a language of twitches, glances, and sympathetic breaths that had bound them together in a world of their own making. This new language was a severing, a declaration of an allegiance to something else, something that had waited patiently in the wings of their grief and had now, at last, found its vessel. The boy sat on the floor, his small back to the cold hearth, and he spoke to the empty space where his sister's cot had once been, his voice weaving a tapestry of phonetic impossibilities that seemed to make the very shadows in the room deepen and coalesce. This was the true beginning of the silence that mattered, for it was the silence of God in the face of a prayer that had been answered by the wrong entity entirely. Their parcel of land, 80 acres of sharp hills and shadowed hollows, had been purchased by Silas Harwick 5 years prior, a deliberate flight from the burgeoning and, in his eyes, decadent world of the East. He had sought a place where a man could be alone with his labor and his God, a place where the murmur of society could not corrupt the sanctity of his family. The Missouri Ozarks, in the middle of the 19th century, offered such isolation in abundance. Their homestead was a lonely outpost of grim determination, miles from the nearest dirt track that could even be generously called a road, and a full day's ride from the fledgling settlement of Jericho's Fall. The cabin itself was a monument to Silas's unyielding will, built from timber he had felled and hewn with his own hands, the logs notched with a precision that bordered on obsession. It was a fortress against the wilderness, but also a cage. Surrounding them was a sea of oak, hickory, and cedar, so dense that in the height of summer, the forest floor was cast in a perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, mineral scent of the limestone bluffs that jutted from the hillsides like broken teeth. It was a land of profound, ancient quiet, where the only sounds were the cawing of crows, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, and the ceaseless, whispering sough of the wind through the high branches. Into this austere world, the twins, Benjamin and Elspeth, had been born. They were small, pale children, with hair the color of dried flax and eyes of a startling, watery blue. From their earliest days, they were inseparable, a single soul cleaved in two. They rarely spoke, even to their parents, preferring their own silent communion, a language of the soul that needed no words. They would spend hours together by the creek, or in the small meadow behind the cabin, their small hands intertwined, their heads bent close as if sharing a single, continuous thought. Silas, in his stern and distant way, saw their bond as a blessing, a sign of innocence preserved from the world's stain. Ada, however, felt a persistent, gnawing unease. She saw not innocence but exclusion. They were a closed circle, and she and her husband were outsiders, orbiting a mystery they could never hope to penetrate. Their silence was not peaceful. It was watchful, ancient, as if they were listening for something that the adult world had long since learned to ignore. The history of the Harwick family was a simple, brutalist story of faith and flight. Silas was the son of a stern Vermont farmer, raised on a diet of scripture and hard labor. He saw the hand of the Almighty in every storm cloud and the whisper of Satan in every idle pleasure. He met Ada at a church meeting, a quiet, gentle woman from a neighboring town, whose piety he mistook for strength. He saw her not as a partner, but as a vessel for the continuation of his righteous line, a helpmeet in his grand project of carving a piece of Eden from the fallen world. He convinced her to leave behind her family and the familiar comforts of New England for the promise of a purer existence on the frontier. He did not tell her of the profound, soul-crushing loneliness that awaited, nor of the ceaseless toil that would leach the color from her cheeks and the light from her eyes. The land he chose was sold to him for a pittance by a speculator in St. Louis who had never laid eyes on it. The previous deed holder was listed as an Eamon O'Connell, a name that appeared in the county ledger only once, a ghost who had purchased the land a decade earlier and then seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. The locals in Jericho's Fall, a rough collection of trappers, farmers, and merchants, had few stories about the specific plot Silas had bought. They spoke in vague terms of the region itself, calling it the Whispering Hills, a place where the wind played tricks on the ear and the shadows played tricks on the eye. They mentioned that the Osage, long since pushed west, had given the area a wide berth, preferring to hunt in the river valleys to the south. There were tales of strange, circular mounds deep in the woods, not of Indian make, and of a peculiar quality to the spring water, which was said to be unnaturally cold, even in the dog days of August. Silas dismissed these as the superstitious ramblings of godless men. He saw only untamed nature, a wilderness to be subdued and bent to his will, a blank slate upon which he could inscribe his family's destiny. He built his cabin on a flat shelf of land overlooking a narrow, winding creek, oblivious to the fact that he had placed his home in the shadow of a towering limestone escarpment, a pale, sheer cliff face that seemed to watch the homestead with a cold, geological indifference. The problem, the true genesis of the horror, began not with a bang, but with a whimper. It started in late July, when the air was a suffocating blanket of heat and humidity. Elspeth, always the more fragile of the twins, developed a cough. At first it was a small, dry thing easily dismissed, but it persisted, deepening in her chest until it racked her small frame with violent, shuddering spasms. Then came the fever, a malevolent heat that burned behind her eyes and left her skin feeling like parchment. Ada nursed her with a desperate, fearful energy. She brewed teas from yarrow and boneset, applied cool cloths to her daughter's forehead, and sat by her cot day and night, whispering prayers until her throat was raw. Silas's response was to retreat further into his faith. He read aloud from the book of Job, his voice a relentless, monotonous drone, as if he could beat back the sickness with the sheer force of scripture. He saw the illness not as a biological reality, but as a trial, a test of his faith sent directly from God. Throughout it all, Benjamin was a silent shadow at his sister's side. He refused to leave her, his small hand clutching hers with a desperate intensity. He did not eat, he did not sleep. He simply watched her, his pale blue eyes wide and unblinking, as if he were trying to absorb her ailment into himself, to draw the fire from her veins and into his own. The doctor from Jericho's Fall, a weary, alcoholic man named Miller, made the long journey to the homestead once. He looked at the girl, listened to her rasping breath, and offered no hope. He spoke of lung fever, of consumption, of God's will, and left them with a bottle of laudanum and a bill that would take Silas a season to pay. Elspeth died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern ridge. Her passing was not a struggle, but a quiet surrender. One moment she was breathing, her breath shallow and ragged, and the next, she was still. The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum that seemed to suck all the air and warmth from the small cabin. Ada's grief was a silent, shattering thing, a collapse inward. Silas stood by the window, his back to the cot, and recited the 23rd Psalm, his voice thick and unsteady. Benjamin did not cry. He simply let go of his sister's hand, which was already growing cool to the touch. He sat there for a long time, staring at her placid, empty face. Then, as his mother finally broke, her body convulsing with a dry, tearless sob, Benjamin opened his mouth. And from the depths of his shared, now severed soul, the other language came forth. The descent began in that very moment, though its full, terrifying dimensions would only reveal themselves over the weeks and months that followed. Silas, in his initial shock, reacted with anger, the only emotion his rigid worldview truly allowed. He grabbed his son by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the boy's thin flesh, and commanded him to stop his blasphemous nonsense, to speak the Lord's English. But Benjamin did not seem to hear him. His eyes were unfocused, looking through his father, through the very walls of the cabin, and into some other place entirely. The stream of alien syllables continued, uninterrupted, its cadence rising and falling with a logic that was utterly inaccessible. Ada, paralyzed by her grief, could only watch, her mind struggling to reconcile the familiar face of her son with the profoundly alien sound that emanated from him. She felt a primal, instinctual revulsion, a mother's terror at seeing her child transformed into something unrecognizable. In the days following Elspeth's burial in a small, hand-dug grave on the hill behind the cabin, the phenomenon did not cease. It intensified. Benjamin no longer spoke only to the empty space his sister had occupied. He spoke to the trees at the edge of the forest, to the strange, moss-covered stones by the creek, and most unervingly, to the sheer, pale face of the limestone escarpment that loomed over their home. He would stand for hours at the edge of the woods, his small form outlined against the deep, impenetrable shadows, and carry on these one-sided conversations. His voice, though small, carried an unnerving distance in the preternatural quiet of the valley, a constant, incomprehensible murmur that became the new soundtrack to his parents' lives. His behavior in all other respects became equally strange. The boy who had once been inseparable from his twin now seemed to crave a different kind of companionship. He lost all interest in his former pastimes. The small wooden animal Silas had carved for him left to gather dust. Instead, he began to draw, using charcoal from the fire pit on scraps of parchment and smoothed pieces of bark. His drawings were not the childish renderings of a 7-year-old. They were intricate, obsessive patterns of interlocking spirals, sharp, angular lines, and complex, repeating geometric shapes that bore a disturbing resemblance to the syntax of his spoken language. They were maps of a place no one had ever been, or perhaps schematics for a thing that should not be built. Silas, in a fit of righteous fury, burned the drawings, declaring them to be the devil's geometry. Benjamin simply watched the flames consume his work with a placid, unnerving detachment, and the next day began to scratch the same symbols into the hard-packed earth of the yard with a sharp stone. The horror, for Silas and Ada, was not in a single terrifying event, but in the slow, inexorable erosion of their reality. It was in the dawning realization that their son was gone, replaced by this strange, placid vessel for an unknown tongue. The boy they had known had been one half of a whole, and with Elspeth's death, the remaining half had not been left empty, but had been filled with something else. Silas's initial anger gave way to a frantic, desperate search for answers within the only framework he possessed, his Bible. He spent his nights poring over the scriptures by candlelight, his finger tracing the lines of Exodus and Deuteronomy, searching for passages on possession, on unclean spirits, on the tongues of angels and the whispers of demons. He saw confirmation of his fears everywhere. He began to believe that the land itself was cursed, a pocket of unholy ground that God had turned his face from, and that his son had become a conduit for the ancient evil that resided there. He began to perform his own desperate, clumsy exorcisms, shouting scripture at the boy, anointing the cabin's doorways with creek water, and praying with a fervor that bordered on madness. But his prayers were met only with the calm, unblinking gaze of his son, and the ceaseless, flowing murmur of that other terrible language. Ada's horror was of a different, more intimate, and perhaps more profound nature. She watched her son and felt not the presence of a demon, but the presence of an absence. She saw the hollowness in his eyes, the mechanical way he moved, the complete lack of any recognizable childhood emotion. The boy who spoke was a stranger, an automaton going through the motions of life. The language, to her, was not the sound of evil, but the sound of absolute, soul-deep loneliness, the desperate, meaningless chatter of a mind that had been fundamentally broken. She began to have waking nightmares, visions of Elspeth not in heaven, but somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark, and that Benjamin's new language was not a possession, but an attempt to bridge the gap, to speak to his sister across a chasm that no living soul was ever meant to cross. She would watch him as he traced his strange symbols in the dirt, and she felt a chilling certainty that he was not drawing, but writing, taking dictation from a source she could not see or hear, a source that resided in the oppressive silence his twin had left behind. The most terrifying moments were the quietest ones. In the dead of night, she would awaken to the sound of his voice from his small cot in the corner, a soft, rhythmic stream of clicks and whispers in the oppressive darkness. He was not speaking in his sleep. He was reporting, delivering a calm, measured account of his day to an unseen and unheard superior. The end of that first, terrible year was marked by the first snowfall, a thick, wet blanket of white that muffled the world and deepened the valley's profound isolation. The snow did not deter Benjamin. He continued his strange pilgrimages to the edge of the forest, his small, dark form a stark contrast against the endless white, his incomprehensible words swallowed by the snow-laden air. Silas had grown gaunt, his face a mask of sleepless, righteous terror. He had taken to carrying his axe with him everywhere, not for chopping wood, but for protection, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting some physical manifestation of the evil he felt around them. Ada had retreated into a world of pure, mechanical function. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind walled off from the horror of her daily existence. The family no longer existed. They were three separate, solitary beings trapped in a small wooden box, each orbiting the same terrible, central mystery. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling drifts against the cabin walls, Ada was mending one of Benjamin's shirts by the weak light of the fire. Silas was slumped at the table, his Bible open but his eyes staring blankly at the rough-hewn wall. Benjamin was in his usual spot on the floor, scratching one of his symbols into a piece of slate with a nail. For hours, the only sounds had been the howl of the wind and the scratch, scratch, scratch of the nail on the stone. Then Benjamin stopped. The sudden silence was jarring. He looked up, his pale eyes fixing on his mother for the first time in what felt like months. A flicker of something, a ghost of a familiar emotion, passed across his features. He opened his mouth, and for one heart-stopping, hopeful moment, Ada thought he was going to speak her name. He uttered a single word, not in English but in the other tongue. It was a word she had heard him say many times before, a complex sound of soft consonants and a long, mournful vowel. But this time he said it with a clear and unmistakable tone of question, of pleading. And then he pointed, his small, trembling finger aimed not at her, not at his father, but at her womb. Ada looked down at her own hands, at the needle and thread, and then at her stomach, where, for the past several weeks, she had been hiding the secret and terrifying knowledge of a new life, a new pregnancy. Her blood ran cold. He knew. This creature that looked like her son knew. The final image of that moment, the one that would be seared into her memory forever, was not of the boy, but of the symbol he had just finished scratching into the slate. It was not one of his usual angular, geometric patterns. It was a crude, but unmistakable, drawing of a spiral turning in on itself, and Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake devouring its own tail. And nestled in the very center of the unending circle was a single tiny dot. The silence that followed Benjamin's gesture was of a new and terrible quality. No longer the mere absence of sound, but a ringing, cognitive void. It was the silence of a chessboard after a move has been made that irrevocably alters the nature of the game. A move so unexpected and yet so perfectly logical in its horror that it paralyzes both players. Ada felt the truth of his knowledge not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, an icy plunge in her viscera that was entirely separate from the nascent stirrings of the new life she carried. The boy's gaze did not waver from her abdomen. His pale blue eyes holding not malice, but a chillingly calm and profound understanding. It was a look that stripped away her secrets, that saw through skin and muscle and blood to the hidden, sacred space within her, rendering it profane with his knowing. He had not merely guessed, he had diagnosed. Silas, who had been staring into the fire, lost in his own grim labyrinth of scripture and fear, was drawn from his reverie by the sudden cessation of the scratching nail on slate. He turned, his eyes slowly adjusting to the tableau. His wife, frozen, her face a mask of ashen disbelief. His son, pointing with that unervingly steady finger. He did not understand at first, his mind, conditioned for external threats and demonic assaults, struggling to process the quiet, intimate nature of the scene. He saw only the boy and the mother, but then his gaze followed the unwavering line of Benjamin's hand, and he saw where it terminated. He saw the way Ada's hands unconsciously cradled her stomach, and in the space of a single, ragged breath, the knowledge passed from her to him. The breath he finally released was not a word, but a guttural groan of pure despair. The entity in his son was not merely content to speak its alien gospel. It was an observer, a cataloger of their lives, aware of their most fiercely guarded secret. The blizzard howled outside, a meaningless tantrum of nature, for the true storm, the one that would tear them apart from the inside out, was already gathered within the four walls of their small, doomed cabin. The symbol on the slate, the serpent consuming itself around a single nascent point, seemed to pulse in the flickering firelight, a pictographic summary of their inescapable fate. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a new kind of madness, a shared paranoia that bound Silas and Ada together even as it pushed them further into their own solitary hells. The pregnancy, now an open secret between them, was never spoken of. It was a third presence in the room, a source of unimaginable dread. For Ada, the physical symptoms of her condition became intertwined with her psychological terror. The waves of nausea that swept over her each morning felt like a physical rejection not of the child, but of the unholy attention that had been drawn to it. Every kick and flutter from within was no longer a reassuring sign of life, but a terrifying reminder that something in her was growing towards a world where her other child had become a mouthpiece for the unspeakable. She felt like a vessel in a war she could not comprehend, her body a battleground for forces ancient and malign. She began to have recurring dreams, not of Benjamin or Elspeth, but of the limestone escarpment that loomed over their home. In her dreams, the cliff face was not stone, but a vast, pale membrane, and she could feel the slow, rhythmic pulse of something immense and dormant sleeping within it, something that was aware of her, and of the new pulse that had begun inside her own body. Silas, for his part, channeled his terror into a frantic, obsessive vigilance. He interpreted Benjamin's knowledge as a clear sign that the entity had laid a claim upon the unborn, that it sought to perpetuate itself, to create a sibling for the thing that now wore his son's face. His prayers became wild, desperate bargains with a God who seemed to have forsaken this small patch of earth entirely. He began to sleep in shifts, sitting in a chair by the hearth with his axe across his lap, watching Benjamin as he slept, as if he could prevent the transmission of some nocturnal, spiritual poison through sheer force of will. The cabin, already a prison, shrank with each passing day, its log walls seeming to press inward. The oppressive winter landscape, a world of endless, undifferentiated white, only served to amplify their isolation, leaving them snowbound and utterly, terrifyingly alone with their changed son and the dreadful secret he had exposed. The language, meanwhile, continued its insidious evolution, its presence expanding from the auditory to the visual, a creeping colonization of their physical space. Benjamin no longer seemed to be speaking to the memory of his sister, or to the trees, or to the rock face. His utterances took on a new quality, a didactic, instructional tone. He would spend hours in the small, snow-covered yard, meticulously arranging rows of black pebbles, fallen twigs, and the frozen bodies of small birds into complex, sprawling patterns on the surface of the snow. They were not random assortments. They were diagrams, glyphs, vast and intricate sentences laid out for some observer in the sky above. They mirrored the symbols he drew, but on a grander, more deliberate scale. Silas, in a panic, would destroy the arrangements as soon as he found them, stamping through the snow with his heavy boots, scattering the components and trying to erase the alien grammar. But Benjamin would simply watch him with that same unnerving placidity, and the next day would begin again in a different spot, his patience seemingly as infinite as the winter itself. Then came the ink. Benjamin, with a quiet, methodical ingenuity that was far beyond his years, managed to create a crude but effective pigment from the soot scraped from the inside of the hearth, mixed with melted snow and the juice of the few withered, frost-bitten berries he could find. With this, he began to write. He started in a corner of the cabin, behind his cot, his first markings small and hesitant. But his confidence grew, and soon he began to cover the rough-hewn interior walls of their home with his script. He used a sharpened stick, a feather, his own fingers. The script flowed from him in an unending stream, lines of sharp, angular characters and coiled spirals filling every available space. It was a form of textual kudzu, a parasitic script that was slowly consuming their home. To live in the cabin was now to be surrounded by the language, to have its incomprehensible truths staring back at you from the very walls that were supposed to offer shelter. Ada would wake in the morning to find new lines of text had appeared overnight, a fresh layer of alien thought applied while they slept. The language was no longer just a sound her son made. It was the texture of their existence, the wallpaper of their despair. The breaking point for Silas came on a morning in late January. He awoke to find that Benjamin had, in the dead of night, written his script across the cover of the family Bible. His black, sooty ink defiling the worn leather with a perfectly executed spiral that seemed to mock the holy words within. The violation was more than Silas could bear. It was a direct challenge, a declaration of war on the last remaining bastion of his sanity and his faith. He realized then that he could not fight this alone, that his own prayers and feeble exorcisms were nothing against an enemy so insidious and so patient. His fear finally outweighed his pride and his deep-seated mistrust of the outside world. He knew he needed help, an authority higher than his own, a man whose profession it was to battle the very forces he believed had laid siege to his home. He resolved to make the journey to Jericho's Fall and seek the counsel of Reverend Mueller, the town's only preacher. The journey was a penance in itself, a brutal, 2-day trek through a landscape of biting wind and deep, treacherous snowdrifts. He traveled on foot, his snowshoes sinking with every laborious step, the cold a constant, gnawing presence that seemed to seep into his very soul. The physical misery of the journey was a welcome distraction from the mental anguish that spurred him onward. He rehearsed what he would say, how he could possibly explain the subtle, creeping nature of the horror that had befallen them, a horror that had no witnesses and no physical proof beyond a child's incomprehensible speech and the strange, dark ink on his cabin walls. He arrived in Jericho's Fall looking like a man who had seen a ghost, his face gaunt and frostbitten, his eyes wide with a fanatic's fire. He found Reverend Mueller in the small, drafty Lutheran church, a severe, imposing man with a thick German accent and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Silas's story came tumbling out, a frantic, disjointed narrative of his son's strange tongue, his unholy knowledge of the pregnancy, and the defilement of the sacred Bible. Mueller listened with a stony, skeptical patience, his mind sorting through the farmer's desperate words, searching for the familiar signposts of grief-induced delusion or simple country superstition. But there was something in Silas's terror, a raw, unvarnished conviction, that gave the preacher pause. It was not the fear of a madman, but the fear of a sane man forced to confront an impossible reality. Against his better judgment, Moved by a grim sense of pastoral duty and a flicker of theological curiosity, Mueller agreed to make the journey back to the Harwick homestead. The arrival of Reverend Mueller brought a new, charged atmosphere to the cabin. He was an anchor to the outside world, a representative of order and orthodoxy in a place that had become untethered from both. He moved with a heavy, deliberate certainty, his black coat a stark slash of authority against the rustic chaos of the home. His initial assessment of the situation was clinical. He saw a family buckling under the immense strain of grief and isolation. He saw a boy, Benjamin, who was pale and withdrawn, but who did not, to his eyes, appear to be in the throes of any violent demonic possession. He observed the script-covered walls with a frown of disapproval, seeing it as evidence of a permissive, undisciplined household that had allowed a child's morbid fantasies to run rampant. He believed that what was needed was not exorcism, but a firm application of prayer, discipline, and God's unwavering word. He sat with Benjamin, attempting to engage him, his voice a low, commanding rumble. He spoke to the boy in English, asking him simple questions about his name, his age. Benjamin only stared at him, his head tilted slightly, as if examining a curious new specimen. He then answered, not in English, but in his own language, his tone soft and conversational. A string of clicks and flowing vowels that Mueller found deeply unsettling in its utter lack of emotional inflection. The preacher, undeterred, switched to his native German, thinking perhaps to shock the boy out of his delusion. The response was the same. Finally, with a sigh of frustration, Mueller began to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin, the ancient words of the church that had been used for centuries to drive back the darkness. Benjamin did not flinch or cry out. He simply listened, his expression one of intense, scholarly concentration, as if he were not the subject of the rite, but its adjudicator. When the prayer was finished, he replied with a long, complex sentence in his own tongue, the cadence and structure of which seemed to be a direct, almost mocking paraphrase of the Latin he had just heard. A seed of genuine unease began to sprout in the preacher's stern, logical mind. This was not the chaotic babbling of a disturbed child. It was a response, an intelligent and structured reply from a mind that was working along lines he could not begin to comprehend. The climax arrived that evening, after a tense, silent supper of salted pork and dried beans. Mueller, his initial skepticism now warring with a growing sense of profound dread, decided that a formal rite of exorcism was necessary after all. He could not, in good conscience, leave this family in such a state without at least attempting to invoke the full power of the church against whatever entity had taken root in this desolate place. He had Silas and Ada kneel on the floor, their hands clasped in prayer, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and terror. He lit a candle, its single flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in time with the alien script that covered the walls. He opened his own small, leather-bound Bible and produced a vial of holy water, sprinkling it around the room, the droplets hissing as they struck the hot surface of the wood stove. Then he began the rite, his voice filling the small cabin, the powerful, ancient Latin words of banishment and condemnation rolling forth like thunder. He called upon the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit to cast out the unclean presence, to sever its unholy connection to the boy, to cleanse the home and restore the child to his rightful mind. The air grew thick, heavy, the silence between his words profound. Outside, the wind rose to a mournful shriek, rattling the cabin's single window as if in response. But Benjamin showed no signs of distress. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his small form bathed in the flickering candlelight, and he watched the preacher with a look of serene, almost pitying concentration. As Mueller reached the crescendo of his invocation, his voice booming with righteous power, asterisk exorcismisti, omnis immundus spiritus, asterisk, Benjamin calmly turned away from him. He walked to the section of the wall beside the hearth, a space he had thus far left blank. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the floor, and as the preacher's words continued to echo in the room, he began to draw. He drew a single new symbol, its lines sharp and precise, executed with a confident, unwavering hand. It was a complex figure, an inverted triangle pierced by a vertical line, with a circle bisected by a crescent moon suspended beneath it. The moment it was complete, Reverend Mueller's voice faltered, the Latin words dying in his throat. His face went pale, a slick sheen of sweat breaking out on his brow. His eyes were fixed on the new drawing, his expression one of pure, unadulterated horror and, most terrifyingly of all, recognition. The preacher stumbled back as if he had been physically struck, his Bible falling from his trembling hands and landing with a soft thud on the packed dirt floor. He stared at the symbol, his mind racing, tearing through the locked archives of his seminary education in Leipzig, a place where he had delved into texts that the church preferred to keep hidden. Apocryphal gospels, Gnostic heresies, the forbidden tracts of medieval alchemists. He knew that symbol. It was ancient, obscure, a sigil he had seen only once before, in a suppressed manuscript detailing pre-Christian cosmologies. It was not a symbol for any common demon or foul spirit catalogued in the standard grimoires. It was a glyph that represented a concept so profoundly heretical that its study had been banned for centuries. It was the sigil for the Chorazane, the Great Unbegetting, a theoretical cosmic entity that was not a creation of God, but a co-eternal and sentient void, a thinking abyss whose only impulse was to unmake, to draw creation back into the perfect, undifferentiated silence from which it had sprung. And it was often associated in those forbidden texts with the corruption of new life, with the turning of the womb into a gateway for its own nullifying influence. To see it here, drawn by the hand of a 7-year-old boy in a primitive cabin in the American wilderness, was a theological impossibility, a shattering of his entire worldview. The thing he was facing was not some minor devil tormenting a grieving family. It was a consciousness, an intelligence of cosmic antiquity and terrifying scope, and it was learning. Without another word, Mueller scrambled to his feet. His authority, his faith, his entire sense of order had been utterly broken. He snatched his Bible from the floor and began stuffing his belongings into his satchel with frantic, clumsy movements, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Asterisk, was this das? Asterisk, Silas whispered, his voice trembling. What is it? The preacher turned to him, his eyes wild with a terror that dwarfed anything Silas had yet felt. There are things buried in the soil of the world that are older than the faith of our fathers. Mueller stammered, his German accent thick with panic. They have their own tongue, their own gospel. You have not brought a demon into your house. You have built your house on top of its pulpit. He offered no blessing, no word of comfort. He simply threw open the cabin door and plunged out into the raging blizzard, choosing the fury of the storm over another moment in the presence of the boy and the ancient, terrible knowledge he was transcribing. He fled, a man of God running for his life, leaving the Harwicks utterly alone, staring at the incomprehensible, blasphemous script that now adorned their wall, its meaning no clearer, but its origin now impossibly, terrifyingly, older and vaster than they could ever have imagined. The blizzard's fury was a pale and fleeting thing compared to the silent, psychic storm that now raged within the Harwick cabin. Reverend Mueller's departure was not a retreat, but a verdict. He had not fled from a possessed child. He had fled from a place of power, a nexus of something ancient and unholy that had merely found a convenient voice. He had left them not with a prayer, but with a curse, and his final, panicked words, asterisk, you have built your house on top of its pulpit, asterisk, reverberated in the ringing silence he left behind. The cabin door, which he had failed to latch in his terror, swung rhythmically on its leather hinges, each inward swing bringing a fresh blast of snow and wind, a weak, physical echo of the cosmic violation that had just occurred. Silas stood as if turned to stone, his gaze fixed on the heretical sigil that now seemed to burn on the wall, a brand marking his home as the property of some other, older god. Ada, kneeling on the cold floor, felt the life within her give a sudden violent kick, as if in response to the preacher's terror. In that moment, she understood with a chilling, maternal certainty that Mueller had not been wrong. They were not merely haunted. They were living on consecrated ground, only the consecration had been performed by a faith that despised the very concept of life, and its one and only sacrament was silence. The boy, Benjamin, the cause of it all, simply picked up the charcoal he had dropped and, with the calm diligence of a stonemason, carefully retraced the lines of his terrible glyph, ensuring its permanence. The remainder of that long, brutal winter passed in a state of suspended dread. The failed exorcism had shattered the last vestiges of Silas's combative faith. The God he had worshipped his entire life, the stern, patriarchal judge of the Old Testament, seemed a frail and distant figure when faced with a symbol that predated Scripture itself. He no longer saw the entity in his son as a demon to be cast out, but as a fundamental property of the valley, as immutable and ever-present as the limestone bedrock beneath their feet. His prayers ceased. His Bible, its cover still marred by the alien script, remained closed on the mantelpiece, a monument to a faith that had failed. His terror, however, did not diminish. It simply changed its nature, curdling from righteous fury into a grim, paranoid vigilance. He became the warden of a prison of his own making. Using nails he had forged himself, he boarded up the cabin's single glass window, plunging their lives into a perpetual, smoky twilight, lit only by the wavering flames of the hearth and the greasy, sputtering light of a single tallow lamp. The darkness, he reasoned, would keep the outside world from looking in, and perhaps keep the thing inside from looking out. Every creak of the logs, every skittering sound from the roof, was now the sound of an enemy seeking entry, or an ally of the thing within seeking to commune. Ada's pregnancy advanced through this sunless, suffocating gloom. Her expanding belly was a constant, terrifying reminder that time was not standing still, but was counting down to some dreadful, unknown culmination. The cabin was no longer a home, but a womb of darkness, gestating both a new child and a new, unspeakable horror, and she was trapped at its very center. With the hesitant arrival of spring, the world outside their self-imposed darkness began to change, and the land itself seemed to conspire with the entity in their sun. The great melting began, the immense weight of the winter's snow dissolving into a million rushing rivulets that carved new paths through the damp, black earth. This erosion did not reveal the familiar patterns of nature. It unveiled a more sinister geology. In the creek bed behind the cabin, the rushing water unearthed stones that were not rounded by their journey, but were etched with sharp, geometric lines that precisely mimicked the characters Benjamin had been scrawling on their walls. Further down, Ada found what she first took to be a fossil, a delicate, spiral shape embedded in a piece of shale. But it was not the fossil of any snail or sea creature she had ever seen. Its form was too perfect, its spiral too mathematically precise, a piece of geometry that had somehow been turned to stone. The land itself, it seemed, was the original manuscript, and her son was merely its latest scribe. Silas, driven by a need to patrol the boundaries of his small kingdom of fear, made a discovery that confirmed the preacher's warning in the most visceral way. The melting snow and thinning undergrowth revealed what had been hidden from him before. One of the strange, circular mounds that the gossips in Jericho's fall had spoken of. It was less than 200 yards from their cabin. A perfect, unnatural dome of earth some 20 feet across, rising from the forest floor. There was no grass upon it, no weeds, only a covering of dark, crumbly soil that felt strangely dead to the touch. A ring of withered, stunted trees surrounded it, their branches twisted away from the mound as if in a state of perpetual revulsion. It was not a burial mound. It felt older, more purposeful. It did not feel like a place where something had been laid to rest, but like a place where something had been sealed away, a plug of earth driven into the throat of a chthonic and malevolent intelligence. Standing before it, Silas felt a profound, intuitive certainty that he was looking at the pulpit Mueller had spoken of, the focal point of the ancient, silent gospel that his son was now preaching with his every breath. Inside the darkened cabin, Benjamin's work underwent a chilling new metamorphosis. He was no longer content to be a mere transcriber of the valley's terrible truths. He had graduated to the role of architect. The project began with a small, fist-sized lump of gray clay he had gathered from the newly thawed creek bank. He brought it inside and placed it in the very center of the cabin's main room. To this, he began to add other materials. The strange etched stones from the creek, the delicate bones of mice and birds he found in the woods, and thin, pliable twigs which he bent into impossible, non-Euclidean angles. Day by day, the structure grew, an exercise in alien architecture. It was not a model of a house or a fort, but a three-dimensional, physical manifestation of his language. It bristled with sharp, angular projections like frozen consonants, and swept into elegant, spiraling curves that mirrored the coiled glyphs on the walls. It was a city for insects of the mind, a cathedral for a silent, geometric god. Silas and Ada became helpless spectators to its creation. Some deep, primal instinct screamed at them to destroy it, to smash the obscene sculpture back into its constituent parts of mud and bone. But they were paralyzed by a new and terrifying sense of fatalism. The entity in their son was not a chaotic force. It was methodical, industrious, and possessed of an infinite patience. To destroy the structure, they felt, would be a pointless gesture, a temporary inconvenience that would only be met with its calm, unhurried reconstruction. And so they watched, their home slowly being terraformed into a temple, the air growing thick with the scent of damp clay and decay, the bizarre sculpture at its heart seeming to absorb the weak, flickering light of the hearth, casting shadows that did not conform to the known laws of light and space. As her body grew heavier, her senses stretched taut by the constant, low-grade terror of her existence, Ada began to experience the most insidious violation of all. The boundary of her own mind, her last sovereign territory, began to dissolve. Benjamin's language, which for months had been a source of auditory torment, a meaningless and alien drone, started to shift in her perception. She did not begin to understand the words, not in any intellectual sense. Instead, she began to feel their emotional texture. Without looking, she could sense when his monologue was shifting from what felt like a declarative statement to a complex question, or when it modulated into a tone of immense, geological sorrow. It was as if the language was bypassing her ears and her intellect and was being absorbed directly into her nervous system. The true horror came one afternoon as she was churning butter, the rhythmic plunge of the dasher a familiar, comforting motion. Benjamin was sitting by his clay structure, speaking to it in a low, continuous stream of hisses and clicks. Lost in the mechanical rhythm of her work, Ada began to hum, a low, tuneless sound in the back of her throat to keep the fear at bay. It took her several minutes to realize what she was doing. Her humming was not random. It was a perfect tonal mimicry of Benjamin's speech. The pitch of her hum rose and fell in precise synchronicity with the vowels of his alien language. She was providing the melody to his words, an unconscious, sympathetic accompaniment. She dropped the dasher, her hand flying to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The infection had spread. The language was no longer just outside her. A part of it was now inside her, and she had given it voice. Her pregnancy, she realized with a fresh wave of terror, was not just a biological process. It was an attunement, a slow, hormonal recalibration of her very soul, making her a more receptive instrument for the valley's silent, terrible music. The final seal on this new, horrifying reality was broken late one night, deep in the suffocating blackness of the cabin. A storm was raging outside, a proper spring deluge of thunder and torrential rain that drummed relentlessly on the roof. Ada lay awake on her straw mattress, her body aching, her mind a churning sea of fear. The child within her was restless, its movements strong and insistent. Across the room, she could hear the soft, rhythmic whisper of Benjamin's nocturnal monologue, a familiar sound that had now become a source of intimate, personal dread. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, a gesture that was once for comfort, but was now for assessment, for surveillance. She could feel the rapid, fluttery beat of the baby's heart against her palm, a frantic, trapped rhythm. And then she heard it. She focused, her breath held tight in her chest, listening past the roar of the rain and the rumble of the thunder, listening only to the two sounds that originated within the cabin. The voice of her son and the heartbeat of her unborn child. They were in lockstep. Benjamin would utter a soft, clicking consonant, and the baby's heart would answer with a single hard thump. He would draw out a long, sibilant hiss, and the heartbeat would accelerate into a frantic, shuddering rhythm that perfectly matched the duration of the sound. It was not a coincidence. The statistical probability was impossible. It was a conversation, a call and response. The thing that spoke through her son, the ancient, patient intelligence that permeated the very soil beneath them, was not ignoring the new life in her womb. It was communing with it, teaching it, shaping it in the darkness with a language of rhythm and pulse, long before it would ever need a tongue or a voice. Her womb was not a sanctuary. It was a schoolroom. Ada lay paralyzed, a prisoner in her own body, forced to witness this unholy catechism. The rain beat down, the thunder cracked, and the dialogue of pulse and whisper continued for what felt like an eternity. She felt a profound and absolute despair, a certainty that the child she carried was no longer entirely hers, if it ever had been. It was being written, coded, its nascent soul inscribed with an alien syntax before it had even taken its first breath. Then, as suddenly as it began, the rhythm broke. The baby's heartbeat settled into a normal, steady pattern, and from the corner of the room, Benjamin's whispering stopped. The ensuing silence was more terrifying than the sound it replaced. It was a waiting silence, a silence of anticipation. Ada strained her ears, listening for his breathing, for any sign that he was still there. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, his voice came again, cutting through the darkness. But it was different. There were no clicks, no hisses, no alien vowels. It was a single word, spoken in clear, unaccented English, the first he had uttered in nearly a year. His voice was not that of a 7-year-old boy. It was flat, devoid of any inflection or emotion, as cold and ancient as the stones in the creek bed. The word he spoke, a calm and simple statement of fact directed into the suffocating darkness, was listening. The single word, listening, hung in the thick, smoky air of the cabin long after the sound itself had faded. It was a word of perfect, horrifying clarity. A shard of ice slid directly into Ada's soul. In that instant, every desperate, rational explanation she had clung to, that Benjamin was lost in grief, that he was touched by a fever of the mind, that he was merely a child acting out a deep and impenetrable trauma, shattered like glass. This was not Benjamin. The voice was his, the mouth was his, but the intelligence behind the word was something else entirely. Something ancient, patient, and fully, terrifyingly lucid. It had understood their language all along, had listened to their whispers, their prayers, their arguments, their cries of despair, treating their native tongue as a secondary, perhaps primitive, dialect to be monitored but not engaged with until now. Ada lay frozen in the darkness, her hands still pressed against her womb, where the frantic, communicative heartbeat had now settled into a calm, steady rhythm. This newfound peace was more terrifying than the previous agitation. It was the quiet of a student who has just understood the lesson, a silence of perfect reception. She did not need to see her husband in the opposite bed to know that he had heard it too. She could feel his wakefulness, his sudden, rigid stillness in the darkness. The word had been a pronouncement for both of them, a confirmation that their nightmare was sentient, and it was watching them with an intelligence that far surpassed their own. The child within her gave a soft, gentle kick, a movement that felt less like a reassurance and more like an acknowledgement. In the days that followed, a new and more unnerving regimen began. The constant, murmuring stream of the alien language that had become the ceaseless soundtrack to their lives dwindled, and then ceased altogether. The silence that replaced it was not a relief, but a new form of psychological torture. It was a weighted, observant silence, thick with unspoken and unspeakable meaning. The oral assault had ended, and a campaign of silent, visual warfare had begun. Benjamin no longer spoke to the walls, the trees, or the clay structure in the center of the room. He now communicated purely through his work, which he continued with an unnerving, single-minded focus. He added to his sculpture with meticulous care, his small hands moving with the certainty of a master craftsman executing a design he had known for 1,000 years. He continued to cover the walls with his script, each new symbol a silent shout into the gloom of the cabin. But the most significant change was in his gaze. He began to watch his parents. He would sit for hours perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Ada as she went about her domestic chores, or on Silas as he mended a piece of harness. It was not the curious gaze of a child. It was a look of profound and dispassionate analysis, the gaze of a biologist observing a specimen in a jar, noting its habits, its weaknesses, its biology, with a cold academic detachment. His silence was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of profound, active concentration. Communication had not stopped. It had merely become more efficient, moving from the clumsy medium of sound to a direct, telepathic channel between the boy, the land, and the gestating life in Ada's womb, a private conversation to which they were no longer privy. Silas, robbed of his faith and now denied even the familiar sound of his enemy, was a man adrift on a sea of silent terror. The preacher's words and the discovery of the dead mound had given his fear a physical location, a geography. No longer able to fight the spirit, he resolved to fight the soil itself. A new obsession took hold of him, a desperate, half-mad conviction that if he could only dig deep enough, he could find some physical root, some tangible heart of the evil and cut it out. He began an excavation. He abandoned all pretense of farming, of tending to the needs of the coming season. His axe, once reserved for felling trees, was now used to hack through the thick, tangled roots that infested the ground around the earthen mound. His spade, meant for turning soil for planting, now served to carve a deep, rectangular pit into the earth at the mound's base. The work was a form of self-flagellation, a penance for having brought his family to this accursed place. Each shovelful of the cold, dense clay was an act of desperate rebellion. He worked from before sunrise until after sunset, his body fueled by a reservoir of pure, unadulterated fear. His hands, once merely calloused, were now a mass of weeping blisters and raw flesh. He grew leaner, harder, his skin baked by the sun, his face a mask of dirt and grim determination. He was no longer a farmer. He was a sapper, a soldier trying to undermine the foundations of an unassailable enemy fortress, driven by the mad hope that the monster he faced had a physical anchor that could be unearthed and destroyed. The moment Silas's trembling, dirt-encrusted fingers made contact with the cold, inscribed surface, the world shifted. It was not a physical tremor, but a sudden, violent activation of the invisible lines of force that connected the pit, the cabin, and the womb. Back at the homestead, Benjamin, who had been silently affixing a bird skull to his ever-growing sculpture, suddenly froze. The skull dropped from his hand and shattered on the floor. His back went ramrod straight, his head snapping back as if pulled by an invisible string. His eyes, which had been fixed on his work, rolled up into his head, leaving only the whites visible. His mouth opened, and from it issued a sound unlike any he had made before. It was not a word, not a syllable, but a single, pure, high-frequency tone, a piercing, inhuman keen that vibrated in the very air of the cabin, causing the single tallow lamp to flicker and the dust motes to dance. In that same instant, Ada, who had been resting on her cot, was seized by a sudden, brutal agony. A powerful, convulsive contraction racked her entire body, forcing a sharp, involuntary cry from her lips. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her belly, her mind reeling in a vortex of pain and terror. This was not the gentle, preparatory tightening she had been told to expect. This was a violent, unnatural spasm, a galvanic, premature signal for a birth that was still weeks away. The circuit had been completed. Silas, the father, had laid his hands upon the altar. Benjamin, the son, had become the resonating bell. And Ada, the mother, had become the sacrificial vessel, her body now responding to a summons that was not of God, nor of nature. The final image of that dreadful afternoon was a triptych of synchronized horror, 3 members of a family bound together in a single, unholy trinity of activation. In the dark, earthen pit, Silas knelt, his hands pressed flat against the ancient, humming tablet, his mind emptied of all thought, feeling only a faint, cold vibration that seemed to travel up his arms and into the base of his skull, a silent, instructional current. In the gloomy cabin, Benjamin stood locked in a state of rigid tension, his body a conduit for the piercing, continuous signal that poured from his mouth, a sound that was not of his own making but was merely passing through him from the earth below. And on the rough-hewn floorboards, Ada writhed, her body seized by another wave of the savage, artificial labor, her hands clawing at her stomach as she felt the child within her move with a new and terrifying vigor. It was no longer the gentle flutter of a gestating infant. It was a churning, a twisting, a purposeful and violent struggling, as if the listener had finished its lesson and was now, with an awful and impatient strength, trying to claw its own way out into the world. The period of quiet observation was over. A terrible and ancient quickening had begun, and a birth was now, unstoppably, imminent. The world was reduced to 3 concurrent and exclusive agonies. For Silas, kneeling in the grave he had dug for himself, the universe was the cold, vibrating hum that traveled up his arms and colonized his skull. It was not a sound, but the ghost of a sound, a silent scream of pure information that bypassed his ears entirely. He saw flashes of impossible geometries, of star systems collapsing and being born, of vast, slow, crystalline thoughts that took millennia to form. He was touching the mind of a god, and that mind was utterly, inhumanly, terrifyingly alien. For Benjamin, in the cabin, the world was the single piercing note that poured through him, scouring his small body of any lingering trace of its former self. He was no longer a boy, but an instrument, a length of wire stretched to its breaking point, resonating with a signal that originated deep in the bedrock beneath him. The note was a command, a broadcast, a declaration that a long-dormant circuit had finally been closed. And for Ada, on the floorboards, the world was afire in her womb, a savage, rhythmic clenching that sought to tear the new life from her prematurely. The pain was absolute, but beneath it was a more profound horror. The feeling of her own body being hijacked, her biological processes turned into a weapon against her. She was a vessel, and the thing she carried was being violently summoned forth by the terrible harmony being played between the Father in the earth and the Son in the house. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silas, his mind fractured by the onslaught of alien data, tore his hands away from the inscribed stone as if it were white-hot iron. He scrambled and clawed his way out of the pit, his breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs, the phantom vibration still humming in the bones of his hands. The moment his feet touched the surface of the normal, uninscribed world, the connection was severed. In the cabin, the piercing note cut off with an unnerving suddenness. Benjamin's rigid body went limp, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap, as still and silent as a discarded doll. Ada's torment ceased instantly, the violent contractions vanishing, leaving in their wake only a deep, trembling exhaustion and the slick, cold sweat of absolute terror. Silas burst through the cabin door moments later, his face a mask of mud and madness, to find his son unconscious and his wife pale and shaking on the floor. A new kind of silence fell upon the room, a silence that was no longer merely observant, but was now charged with the memory of a direct, physical assault. They were no longer simply being watched or listened to. They now knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in their bones, that the entity could touch them, could seize control of their very muscles and nerves, whenever it chose. The line between psychological and physical horror had been completely and irrevocably erased. Silas did not fill in the pit. He could not. In the days that followed, he found himself drawn back to it by a force of horrified fascination that was stronger than his fear. He would stand on the edge, staring down at the exposed sliver of the black, gleaming surface, as a man might stare at a caged wolf, knowing that the bars will not hold forever. He took a shovel and, with a new and terrifyingly delicate caution, began to clear the dirt from the surface of the stone, not to dig deeper, but to understand its scale. He worked for days, expanding the hole laterally, his movements slow and reverent, like a priest tending an altar. The object was immense. It extended in every direction, a single, continuous, polished plane of the black material, disappearing under the earth beyond the reach of his shovel. It was not a tablet or a stone he had found. He had merely scraped the dirt from a single, infinitesimal point on the surface of something that constituted the very foundation of the valley. He began to trace the script etched upon it with a trembling finger, comparing it to the frantic, imitative scrawls upon his cabin walls. His son's work was a crude, childish copy. The original, here on the stone, was impossibly precise, filled with subtleties of form and structure that Benjamin's hand could never replicate. A new, intuitive understanding began to dawn in the ruins of Silas's mind. This was not a buried object. It was a dormant organism, a geological consciousness, vast and slow, whose thoughts were the language, whose nerves were the strange, metallic veins in the rock, and whose dreams had been seeping up through the soil for eons, waiting for a mind receptive enough to hear them. The violent, aborted labor had permanently altered Ada's perceptions, as if the raw force of the event had blasted open new, unwanted sensory pathways in her mind. The world was no longer the same. A constant, low-frequency hum now pervaded her every waking moment, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the ground beneath her feet, a subtle, vibrational reminder of the immense, sleeping thing upon which they lived. She began to see the script in the periphery of her vision, fleeting, ghost-like afterimages that would burn themselves into the air for a moment and then fade. She would see them in the pattern of cracks on a dried mud puddle, in the constellation of stars through a gap in the roof, in the tangled network of branches against the evening sky. The language was leaking into her sight, branding itself onto her reality. But the most terrifying change was in her understanding. Thoughts that were not her own would now bleed into her consciousness. She would be kneading dough, and a string of Benjamin's old, alien words would surface in her memory, and for a heart-stopping instant, she would grasp its meaning. The concepts were monstrously abstract, devoid of any human emotional context. She would understand a phrase to mean the precise rate of iron oxidation in deoxygenated blood. Another would translate to a complex, multivariable equation describing the optimal angle for spore dispersal in a vacuum. These packets of alien knowledge would flood her mind, leaving her dizzy and nauseous, feeling as though a needle had been pushed through her eye and into her brain, injecting a drop of some incomprehensible, cosmic poison. Benjamin awoke 2 days after his collapse. The last faint flicker of the boy who had been was now entirely extinguished. The vacant, placid expression was gone, replaced by one of grim, unnerving purpose. He moved with a new precision, his gestures economical and swift, like those of an insect. He no longer seemed to see his parents at all. They were merely pieces of furniture in his workshop. His entire being was now singularly focused on the bizarre structure of clay and bone in the center of the cabin. He began to work on it with a frantic, feverish energy, as if some internal clock had been started and was now rapidly ticking down. The sculpture was no longer a mere model or a piece of art. It was a device, and he was a technician desperately trying to complete its assembly. He began to incorporate new and more intimate materials into its construction. He would gather the soiled rags that Silas used to staunch his nosebleeds and meticulously soak the dried blood from them with a little water, mixing the resulting brownish liquid into the clay to give it a sickening, ruddy hue. He plucked strands of his own pale hair and wove them into the structure, creating a fine, web-like network that seemed to bind the various components together. He scraped flakes of rust from his father's axe and spade, grinding them into a fine powder and pressing it into the wet clay, forming strange, metallic circuits that ran across the sculpture's surface. He was not just building something, he was feeding it, giving it parts of themselves, transforming it from a mere effigy into a sympathetic biological machine. Ada watched this feverish, unholy work with her newly awakened senses. The low hum that was the constant background noise of her life was now noticeably stronger near the sculpture, as if the object were a lens, focusing the valley's ambient energy into a single coherent point. Her gaze was drawn to the structure's core, a dense, lattice-like cage of woven twigs and animal sinew. Deep within it, she could just make out a small, dark object that seemed to be the source of the intensified vibration. It was something she had not noticed before, something Benjamin must have placed there while she was lost in her own terror. One night, when the cabin was steeped in a profound and heavy silence, and Benjamin lay in a state of rigid, unbreathing sleep, She summoned every ounce of her courage and crept towards the obscene thing in the center of her home. The hum grew louder as she approached, a deep, resonant thrumming that she felt in her teeth and in the bones of her unborn child. She peered through the gaps in the latticework, her eyes struggling to adjust in the near-total darkness. She saw it. It was a small, withered, brownish coil of organic matter, a thing that was both familiar and utterly, profanely, out of place. A wave of ice-cold recognition washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It was the desiccated stump of an umbilical cord, preserved with salt and herbs, that she had kept in a small wooden box since the birth of her twins. It was Elspeth's. He had found her secret, pathetic memorial to her lost child and had desecrated it, making the last physical remnant of her dead daughter the profane heart, the biological battery, for his terrible machine. A strangled gasp escaped Ada's throat. She recoiled from the sculpture, her hand flying to her mouth, the horror of the violation so profound it threatened to unmake her. The sound, small as it was enough. On his cot across the room, Benjamin's eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a waking child, clouded with sleep. They were wide, clear, and intensely focused, glowing with a faint, reflected light from the dying embers in the hearth. He did not look at his mother. His gaze was fixed on the sculpture, on the desecrated relic at its core. He sat bolt upright, his movements sharp and mechanical. And then he spoke. The voice was the same flat, English monotone he had used before, the voice of the intelligence that wore him like a coat. He spoke not to Ada, but to his creation, a simple statement of fact, a logistical observation on the state of his project, a sentence that contained the entirety of their doom. "It is not complete," the boy's voice said, echoing in the cold, silent cabin. "It requires the new cord." Ada froze, her hand dropping from her mouth and instinctively, protectively, clutching her own swollen womb. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle fell into place. The entity did not want her baby to live. It did not want another servant. It had orchestrated this entire 9-month ordeal, this slow, meticulous descent into hell, for the sole purpose of harvesting a single, specific biological component. Her child was not a child. It was a crop, and the time for the harvest was now terrifyingly, unavoidably, at hand. The breaking point for Silas was inevitable. He could not fight the entity in the ground, and he could not bring himself to harm the thing that wore his son's face. But the sculpture, the obscene nexus of mud and blood and bone that now dominated their small home, that he could destroy. It was a tangible object, a physical manifestation of their nightmare, and in his fractured mind, he became convinced that it was the linchpin, the focus of the entity's power. He raised the axe high above his head, the polished steel catching a flicker of candlelight, a final, desperate gesture of defiance. As the axe began its downward arc, the cabin was plunged into a new dimension of horror. The low hum emanating from the sculpture transformed, rising in pitch with impossible speed into a piercing, deafening shriek. The fine, rust-colored lines on the sculpture's surface suddenly ignited with a cold, sickly, greenish-white phosphorescence. An invisible wall of force erupted from the device, tearing the axe from Silas's grip and throwing him backward against the far wall. As if in resonance, the script on the cabin walls began to glow with the same ghastly light, turning the room into a shrieking, vibrational cage. The true target of that protocol was not Silas. It was Ada. The moment the shriek began, her body was seized by a single, explosive, all-consuming contraction. Her water broke, and the final stages of labor began with unnatural violence. This was not a birth. It was an eviction, an emergency harvest. Through the haze of his own pain, Silas looked up and saw his son. Benjamin was rising from his cot, not with confusion, but with the calm deliberation of a technician. He moved with an unearthly grace through the glowing, shrieking chaos, and placed his small hands upon the humming sculpture. The alien language erupted from his throat, a burst of loud, clipped, authoritative commands. His work complete, he turned from the device. He looked at his mother, writhing on the floor, and began to walk towards her, his steps slow and measured, His small hands, smeared with the clay and blood of his creation, held outstretched before him. In the calm, purposeful set of Benjamin's features, Silas saw the placid, professional, and utterly terrifying demeanor of a midwife. He was here to receive. The child came forth in a final, tearing rush into a glowing, shrieking cage of alien geometry. It was a boy, small, perfectly formed, and shockingly, terribly silent. He did not cry. The moment he was free, the shriek from the sculpture and the glow from the walls winked out, plunging the room into a sudden, deafening silence. Benjamin, moving with swift efficiency, took a sharp, flat stone from his pocket and severed the umbilical cord. The baby did not flinch. Its pale, depthless blue eyes were locked in a silent communion with the brother who had summoned it. Benjamin took the glistening, blood-rich prize and carried it to the sculpture. With the delicate precision of a jeweler, he wove the fresh cord into a space beside the withered stump of Elspeth's, connecting it to two small, rust-colored nodes. The sculpture gave a single, soft hum, and a pulse of sickly green light emanated from its core before fading. The machine was powered on.